Hi, I'm Steve Murgatroyd, the co-editor of this book with J.C. Couture from the Alberta Teachers Association. The idea behind the book is to position equity as a major driver for public policy in education. The book is sponsored by the Special Education Council, and their interest in this book is that there's a lot of young people who've been coded as having special needs. How do we include them in an education system that's good for them and good for all children? In fact, the underlying theme of this book and several others that we've published is about the idea of a great school for all. How do we create the conditions of practice for teachers and the conditions of learning for students that make their learning experience at school simply outstanding? That's our big challenge. Now, equity is a major public policy issue. President Barack Obama has seen it as the defining issue of our time. Others who've been looking at equity for a long time also see this as a major issue. In fact, it's nothing new. Plato, who didn't play for the Oilers or any other NHL team as far as I can remember, but in fact was one of the world's leading philosophers, highlighted equity as a major issue in civil society. So equity has been around as a major public policy concern for a long time. So why is it suddenly important now? Let me give you some context, and let's begin with basic economics. In 2013, a Canadian researcher called Miles Korak published a chart that he called the Gatsby curve, kind of aptly named since the film of the same name, the Gatsby film, appeared at the same time. This shows the extent to which social mobility is inherited through the conditions of wealth of your family. You'll see from this chart that people living in the United Kingdom or the United States or Italy are more likely to be socially successful if their parents were and their grandparents were. In Scandinavia, Finland, Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, this is less likely to be the case. Canada sits in the middle, but is going in the wrong direction. It's getting to the point where the sons and daughters of the top 1, 2, 3, 4, 5% are more likely to sustain their wealth and their social mobility and their ability to hire and fire others simply because they inherited that right from their parents. This is a major concern because if the top 1% are able to influence not simply their own generation, but subsequent ones, how can we ensure that education makes a difference to the way society develops and grows? So, let's look at the Canadian rich. They don't want us to talk about equity. Why? Well, this chart shows that they've been getting richer. The blue line in the middle of this chart shows the average development of wealth for a Canadian citizen. The dotted line above it shows the top 1%. And the solid blue line beneath the middle line shows what's happened to Canadian poor. The message is simple. The rich get richer, the middle class get poorer, and the poor remain, as they always have been, poor. The red line shows taxation, and taxation levels for the rich have gone down, while those for the middle class have gone up. So we're not pursuing equity as a policy. We're actually allowing the rich to get richer. And just to show that in action, since 1980, the top 10% of earners have earned 34% increases in their salaries and wage and income position, whereas the bottom 10% have only gained by 11% since 1980. In fact, some recent research shows that just 85 people have the same wealth as 1/3 of the population of planet Earth. So this notion that we're living in an equal society where merit will enable you to be mobile and education will make a difference to your mobility is beginning to be problematic. Another aspect of the context that we should understand in any conversation about equity is that youth unemployment, that's the employment of 15 to 24-year-olds in Canada, is actually rising quite sharply. It's currently about 11%, and it's growing. This chart makes that very clear. So, to summarize this economic context, rising inequality is a major issue for Canada, but it's also a global phenomenon. Income inequality has been rising in Canada since the early 1980s. And while the tax transfer system, the movement of money from the federal government to the provincial government to enable social programs and education and healthcare is important, it's not kept pace with the developments in our society. All of this is made worse and more complex by some demographic facts. It's very simple. Canada is having a problem in replacing itself in terms of birth rates. We're just not breeding enough. In fact, Statistics Canada suggests that by 2030, which is not that far away, Canada will be entirely dependent on immigration for its economic well-being. So Canada's changing, income inequality is rising, the poor remain poor, the middle class are being squeezed, and education isn't making up for income inequality differences. That's the problem. Now, I want to show you a series of things about Alberta and its economic position. We'll not speak for a few moments. You can just look at these slides. Now let's turn our attention to social mobility. When I went to school, and I left in 1969, so it's a long time ago, I actually started school in 1953, we were told that a good education will guarantee you not only a good job, but the prospects of better jobs in the future. In other words, social mobility equaled education. This was part of the meritocracy that we were told was going to be the hallmark of the 20th and the 21st centuries, that by merit you could get anywhere. It's kind of a version of the American dream. Good education, good networks will get you anywhere in the United States. Anybody can become whatever they want to be. This is not at all true, and never really has been, as you saw from the Gatsby curve and other material we showed you earlier in this program. So let's understand some things about social mobility. What do we need to do to enable Canadians to be much more mobile as a result of our investments in their well-being, their education, and in social programs? I think there are 5 things that we could look at, especially here in Alberta. The first thing to do is to look at base income equality. That is, our investment in ensuring that there's nobody on the poverty line or below it here in Alberta. There's an interesting experiment that was conducted in Dauphin, Manitoba in the early 1970s. Rather than simply use the minimum wage as a poverty alleviation mechanism, the population of Dauphin was guaranteed a living family income. That is, families were paid at a base level that was sufficient to take everybody in that community off the poverty line. The results of that experiment, which was one of the most major social experiments in Canadian history, was that educational outcomes improved dramatically, health outcomes improved dramatically, and employment and entrepreneurship grew in that community. That community has been studied for about 30 years now, and there's some terrific data showing that making a difference to base income equality, taking people off poverty, makes a massive difference to their social mobility and their ability to maintain self-management and become resilient members of communities. The second thing we know is that early childhood education, particularly education that builds on play and the development of language and social skills, can have a huge impact in the subsequent careers of children and young people. Indeed, using early education to stimulate a fascination and interest in language and learning and in understanding the world is the hallmark of a developed society committed to equity. The third thing is to really invest in a high-quality education system that is good for all students, whatever their background, whether they're First Nations, have special needs, or are students from immigrant families or from Canadian families. We need to design a flexible, responsive, nimble education system that's not based on standardization, but is based upon understanding the needs of different groups within a school and responding to them appropriately. I'll say more about this in a moment. The fourth thing, and I think this is very important and of growing importance in society, is that we need to develop the skills of resilience of young people. Resilience is about being able to cope with whatever the world throws at you. Coping is beyond just simply existing. It's about responding positively to challenge. One of the characteristics of young people at the moment, as told to me by many of my psychology friends, is that there's a strong sense that their identity is missing, that they are not sure who they are anymore. In fact, in another book I wrote called Rethinking the Future, I argued that one of the key issues of our society at this time is this loss of identity, the loss of self. One of the things we all need to do as parents, teachers, community members, members of organizations, is help to build the resilience of our young people. And that requires the fifth thing, that we need to see the school as a hub in a community where adults are welcomed as mentors, coaches, and guides for young people. All young people need adult role models. They need a sound, solid, parent-like figure in their lives that will support them, that will challenge them, that will nurture them and coach and guide them for their difficult future. So these five things that I've mentioned here are keys to social mobility. And I think we need to build our school systems around these kind of major developments we need to engage in. So, in the last part of this talk, I'd like to focus on education policy, about how education can shape up and make equity a major part of our society. At the moment, Canada, many jurisdictions in Canada, including Alberta, is at a tipping point between two completely different frameworks for its school systems. One we'll call the GERM movement, Global Education Reform Movement, and the other we'll call equity. So let me just briefly rehearse the idea of GERM. The Global Education Reform Movement is beginning to influence public policy in many Canadian provinces, especially here in the West, but also in many parts of the United States, and is the driving policies behind reform in England and Australia. So let's summarize what this looks like. The first is that schools are set targets, performance targets, targets that are based on standardized tests. The second is that everybody is expected to make decisions early about the kind of careers they want to pursue and are streamed. Now, that's not happening in Canada right now, though there are signs of its emergence in some of the policy conversations that I've been privy to especially in eastern Canada and in parts of the West. We've heard a lot in the last few years about the personalization of learning, about the need to use technology to enable each individual student to learn at their own pace at any time and anywhere. This requires massive investments in public infrastructure, particularly in broadband infrastructure, but also in useful technologies. It also requires a significant investment in the professional development of teachers. One of the other characteristics of GERM is a focus on fewer subjects. Gone are many of the fine arts, gone are many of the interesting pursuits that many of us found the core of our school education. And in their place is a relentless focus on science, technology, engineering subjects, and mathematics. It's as if STEM, these core subjects, was going to be the future of us all, and it's not. There's growing evidence, especially from developed economies, that design-based learning, learning from the arts, learning from design, learning from film, learning from the use and development of games in computing, that these things are likely to be as important to our economy as science, technology, engineering, and maths. So rather than throwing them out, we should continue to have a broad-based public education. Another feature of GERM is this relentless focus on standards and quality as measured by standardized high achievement tests. And testing and test-based accountability drives a lot of policy in education, even though we do know that these tests are not measuring most of the learning that students actually engage in. In many of the systems that have adopted GERM, such as England, you see just constant reform. In the United Kingdom, there have been over 600 reforms of education since 1998. And all of this is based on very weak evidence, evidence that's chosen to support policy as opposed to evidence-based decisions which take an informed view of all the evidence available and make decisions about how it should be implemented. No, we don't do that in GERM. We simply choose those bits of evidence that support the view that we take. A very good example of that is merit pay for teachers, part of this accountability and testing kind of regime. There is no compelling evidence that merit pay for teachers works. Indeed, there's compelling evidence that it doesn't. But this doesn't stop some evidence being used to support that kind of policy reform. So that's GERM. And I'm not saying that GERM is the spirit and frame of policy in Canada right now. I'm saying it's beginning to emerge as a frame for policy. So what's the alternative? Well, we think the alternative is around equity. And this is what this looks like. Equity requires a very broad curriculum where teachers work on that curriculum in partnership with the community and parents and students to make sure that the needs of the children in their care are being met. We encourage creativity and innovation, not just by students, but by our professional teachers. We invest in assessment that helps teachers make good decisions about what to do next for their students. We invest in teachers because the profession drives learning. In fact, one of the necessary conditions for a successful system is that the conditions of practice for teaching enable teachers to do an outstanding job. This means that professional development investments need to be there, class size needs to be right, support for teachers in terms of special needs needs to be appropriate, adequate, and timely. So if the conditions of practice aren't right, none of the educational systems will work well. At the heart of an equity-based system is the trust that we should have in our professionals. And that means that we need to focus on enabling professionals to exercise professional responsibility. We also make decisions based upon a systematic review of all of the evidence available before making a change, which would likely lead to fewer changes in our education system if it's designed right in the first place. Now, we've positioned these as competing ideologies because they are. We can see from work in the United States, in England, in other parts of the world, where germ has taken hold, that performance isn't great. In fact, all of the OECD analysis of the data they collect from their PISA evaluations show that systems based on equity are the highest performing systems in the world. So we have these choices to make. And I think Canada, and especially Alberta, is at a tipping point in these two systems. So let me just pause and pay attention to special needs students. In a germ system, they are actually problematic for germ schools because those schools are rewarded and teachers are rewarded in merit pay for their results. Special needs students have terrific needs for attention and care and concern. In an equity system, it's more likely that the needs of special education, and especially inclusion, are well met. The conditions of practice are what shape our response to special needs students. So the issue of inclusion should actually begin with the question of inclusion into what? The germ system, global education reform schools, are not geared for inclusion that's meaningful and mindful. An equity-based system is designed around the needs of those students and others, and creating the opportunities for those students to succeed at their own level. That's what equity looks like. Equity isn't simply about equal access to opportunities. It's ensuring that every child has the opportunity to succeed at their own level. So, I think we have 5 major challenges, especially here in Alberta. The first one of these is the education of First Nations students. How do we ensure that the outcomes of our investment in their learning and their investments of time and energy produce the same kind of outcomes that children from other communities are seeing and achieving? Our results for First Nations students are poor. We could do a lot better. The second kind of major issue for me is building an education system built around equity. The third is to be concerned about how we create the conditions of practice and a great school for all everywhere in our country, not just in the cities. By 2030, some 80% of every Canadian will live in cities. The denuding of our rural communities of people and resources is ongoing. And yet those rural communities are very important to us. How do we ensure that great schools are not just the large schools in cities, but are the small schools in every community everywhere in Canada? How do we meet the inclusion needs of special education students? And a last concern I have is about ensuring that boys do better than they're doing now. Our education system doesn't favour one gender over the other, but if you look at the performance of boys in our system, it's getting poorer and poorer each year. We need to pay attention to a design of an education system that maximizes learning and outcomes for boys as well as girls. So, equity. It's a major issue. Pay attention. Think. Read the book.